then try refreshing. So if you're watching in a browser, use the browser's refresh function. If you're watching in the app, try leaving the tour, coming back in. If after refreshing you have a picture but no sound, there's in the top right of your screen, you might need to delve a little bit into the menu to find it, but there is a function, an unmute function, that you can use to restore the sound. And as always, you can take postcards using the button in the bottom center of the screen. And yeah, as I say, the as live format, we run through. When I flip the camera, we'll have the video, I'll play the video through. You'll see everything looks pretty much as it does when we're live in a place. Postcards generally come out pretty well on these tours. And the only thing we can't do, obviously, is go and sort of take a detour suddenly and then off to a different part, because I filmed what I filmed. But I try to give a pause for filming when I'm a pause for postcards when I'm filming, so that you can get the best out of the tour. So by way of introduction, we are going to be looking at a place called Bournville, and Bournville is a suburb of Birmingham, really, these days, with about 20,000 people living there. But the core of Bournville is a village created by a family called the Cadbury family. And the Cadbury family were one of our most famous manufacturing families in Birmingham and in the UK, making chocolate. And in 1879, they moved from their factory in the centre of Birmingham, where there wasn't room to expand anymore, and they acquired a whole load of what had previously been farmland about 5 miles to the southwest. At that time, outside Birmingham, as the city has expanded to what it is today, it's kind of swallowed it up. But they created not only a place for their factory, but also a place for their workers to live, and with a lot of facilities and infrastructure provided for their workers. And that's what we're going to be exploring. And really, the name Bournville is synonymous with Cadbury's. Their flagship brand of dark chocolate is called Bournville to this day, named after the place that it's produced. So without further ado, I think we should turn around our screen, and I should start the video going. And let me wait a minute. Let me do that. Okay, here we are. Nicole, why is Cadbury chocolate not available in the US? You have it in Canada. I have no idea. I don't know what their arrangements are. I know that the taste in chocolate is quite different, and I think in the US chocolate is very different from the chocolate we have here. But I don't know. So we are looking here across at one of the original buildings. It is available. I don't think it's as widely available. Bronwyn, that's great. The family members working here. We're looking across at one of the first buildings that was constructed here by the Cadbury family in the 1870s. And we can see the larger, more modern buildings of the factory behind. This building is called Number 1 Lodge, and it was the original administrative officers of the management of the company when they moved over here from the centre of Birmingham. And we can see the iconic Cadbury name there, the Cadbury signature on this purple sign. The purple colour is their corporate colour, the colour of the wrappers of their most iconic brand, Cadbury's Dairy Milk. And one of the first things we notice about the building is that it's not built in a style of the 1870s. It is built in a style that is a throwback to earlier times, and the Cadbury family really wanted to do that. they wanted Bournville to not look like it was new and modern. They wanted it to look like an English village. So a lot of things that they built were in a style that would suggest that it had been there for a long time. And they were sort of interested in the historic designs and making things look really quite traditional. These days, this is still administrative offices here in Number One Lodge. It's also where we can find the staff shop. Imagine getting the discounts in the staff shop. That's where it's found. But you do have to show your ID to get in. We can't, unfortunately, go in. Now, these signs tell us that the roadway is approaching a bridge. And the reason I'm showing you this, I'm not obsessed with road signs, but that's very important because where the bridge is going under this, where the bridge here is going over the road, that is the railway bridge. And one of the important things about the land that the Cadburys acquired was that it was on both the canal and the railway lines. So, that's the transportation links right here, close to the factory. And we get a look here at how everything in the area is kind of this purple colour, from the signs to the railings to the lamp posts. That's really kind of this corporate design that they've got going on here. The staff sales shop. And so being on the canal and the railway line was very important, because that was the way that their products were, the raw materials to make the chocolate was being brought in at the time. It's before road transportation was a thing. It's also enabling the workers to get here, because the village wasn't built immediately as soon as the factory was here. It grew up more, took a longer time to build. And also, not everyone who worked at Cadbury's, even back in the day, lived here in Bournville. Many people commuted. Yes, you're right. It is. The Cadbury purple is even on the signs on the railway station. And so having the train link was very important. Now we get another idea here. This was a kind of a community hall where people could hold events, but much grander building across the road here with the tower. What a beautiful building. And this might look like maybe a school or even a religious building, but it's not. This is a swimming pool. So the Cadbury family were keen to build leisure facilities and promote health and well-being among their workers. They built a swimming pool here. Now, at that time, when this was built, society was still quite conservative. They had separate swimming baths for men and women. This was the ladies' swimming baths, no longer used as a swimming pool today. The building's sort of under redevelopment. But a lot of women who worked here, thousands of them, would have learned to swim here because they could get swimming lessons on the company time. So they could take an hour out of their work, and they could go here and learn to swim. So they're promoting exercise and health and well-being among their workforce. It's part of the Cadbury's social conscience, which was a very strong motivating factor in what they did here at Bournville. So here we have the beautiful sign, Bournville Baths. 1904 it was completed. So they moved here in 1879, and then the village was built up gradually over time. Now here on the baths is also the Bournville War Memorial, dedicated to those associated with the company who lost their lives in the 2 world wars. And the left-hand plaque, it's quite hard to read, but it does tell us that 2,148 Cadbury employees, men, served in the First World War, of whom 218 lost their lives. Second World War, it doesn't specify the numbers. Nicole, no, that the swimming baths is not operational anymore. If that's what you mean, the factory is still very much operational. Bronwyn, that's a good question. I think they're about contemporaneous with one another. I'm really not sure whether, because it was kind of something that various employees in different parts of the country were trying to do, often because they had quite strong religious and social consciences in terms of building villages for their workers to live in. I think Bournville might be earlier, but I wouldn't be 100% sure on that. So this is the main road entrance into the factory complex these days, where you'll see tankers coming in with, these days the deliveries, a lot of them come by road rather than by rail or canal. So when this was first built, they would the sugar, the cocoa would have come in from the Caribbean. It would have come into the port of Liverpool, and then it would come by canal to Bournville. Nowadays, a lot of it comes, at least the local delivery section comes by road. They have about 200 tons of cocoa and cocoa butter being delivered to the factory every day. They also have huge tankers full of milk. And the Cadbury's company actually owns quite a lot of farms. From time to time, you'll be driving around the countryside in England, and you'll pass the entrance to a farm, and you'll see that distinctive purple color like the railings here and the Cadbury logo. And that will tell you that it's a dairy farm owned by and operated by Cadbury's to supply its factory. So all of the cocoa they use to make their chocolate here these days comes from Ghana. And they are part of a scheme called Cocoa Life, which is designed to promote fair prices and decent working conditions for the people who are farming the raw materials over in Ghana. It's really quite an important link for them. Now, this is the modern building, Bournville Place. This is kind of the corporate HQ here, if you like. This is the sort of where the offices are, and the main security desk for business side of it. So I don't like to film too long here, because we don't want them to think we're some kind of industrial espionage or anything going on. But these days the company is owned by multinational company Mondelez International, having been taken over in 2012 by the Kraft company. £12.5 billion takeover of Cadbury's by Kraft in 2012. There was a lot of concerns that they might move production overseas, but actually they didn't do that. They invested £75 million in Bournville to modernise and improve the site to keep the employment here in its traditional location. So we're heading along here, and we're going to see a little bit more of some of the facilities. So we saw the swimming pool, and they also are promoting exercise among their employees. The Cadbury brothers, who opened the site here, they were both keen sportsmen. They both played rugby and cricket. And so we have here sports fields and this beautiful building, again in this like throwback Tudor style, built in 1902 by the Cadbury family for the workers as a clubhouse for the Bournville sports clubs and as an event space. Still has exactly the same function today. It's adjacent to the playing fields. Now, the playing fields here were one of the playing fields. Across the road to our left, nowadays it has housing built on it, I think, but that was originally another playing field, because just like the swimming pool, the playing fields were separated to male and female. This was the men's playing field that's still here in front of us. And the other one was called the girls' playing field. Now, notice not the women's playing field. That is not really derogatory. It's not calling women girls in that sense. Effectively, it's because the people who worked for Cadbury's were either men or mainly or girls, because the Cadbury's were still very, as enlightened as they were very traditional, very conservative, and they believed that very strongly in a strong family and home life, and so they didn't employ married women. If a young woman or a young girl was working at Cadbury's, if she got married, she was given a financial gift, a Bible to be a family Bible, and thanked very much for her work. and let go. So that's why they have these designations, men and girls, because the majority of the workforce were either men or young, unmarried female employees. The sports field here is still used all year round. There are sports teams associated with the factory, but also local schools and clubs play here. They also use the sports fields for for big sort of village festivals and events in the summertime. So, they're promoting health and well-being among their workforce. They're doing a similar thing by providing company medical care. Now, the late 19th century, this is something that you just didn't get. Most people really struggled to have any kind of access to medical care unless they were pretty wealthy. They relied on charity maybe, or religious organizations. So to have a company medical scheme where you could get checked out and your family could be covered by it as well. They also had sick pay. That was kind of a revolutionary thing too. These days we think it's kind of a sort of a standard thing that would be available to people, but it wasn't the case back then by any stretch of the imagination. So, they are promoting a healthy workforce, and one of the benefits they would have had from being here on the edge of the city rather than in the heart of Birmingham where their original factory was, is that the people are breathing fresher air rather than the polluted air of the industrial city at that time. So here we get a nice look at factory buildings. Most of the buildings we see here from the 1930s. They sort of expanded the factory over the years. And, the Cadburys built a lot of things for their workers, but sometimes the workers reciprocated. And this little statue we can see here is an example of that. This is a statue of a Greek goddess of dance, song, and eternal youth called Terpsichore. Now, this would probably have been quite shocking when it was created in the early 30s, because she's naked, by a Birmingham sculptor called William Bloy, who was actually quite prolific, but this is one of his very early works. And this was presented to the Cadbury family by their workers to mark 100 years of the company having its first factory before they ever moved to Bournville. And it has a fountain around it, which does have water flowing through it in the summertime. The locals and the factory workers just knew it simply as the bird bath. So here's a factory building. This section of the factory, I think, is mainly office space. There's also some of the canteens and these kinds of things in this particular part of the building. And then as we go further along, beyond the big tree there, you're getting into the actual production facilities. So about 1,500 people work at Bournville in the factory these days. Of course, it's heavily mechanized, so there are far fewer employees than would have been the case, 100 years ago. But, still providing good employment. These days, most of the employees don't live in Bournville because Bournville has become quite a popular and quite an expensive part of Birmingham to live in. So, your average worker in the chocolate factory can no longer afford to live there because gone are the original Cadbury family schemes of subsidised rents. That doesn't exist anymore. Although the Cadbury family and the Bournville Trust owns the land still, most of the houses themselves are now privately owned. So we're making our way down, and again we can get a little view into the factory, and this is one of the areas where we really benefit from doing the tour in this particular format, because this is an area where I always struggle with signal when I'm doing live tours. It's really, we've sort of come down a dip, and you've got these huge factory buildings all around, and probably the machinery and all that kind of thing is not exactly conducive to getting a strong signal. So this is an area where it's really nice to be able to actually show it to you and to talk about it without constantly worrying whether my signal is going to suddenly disappear or not. So, they're producing quite a lot here, and they, up until a couple of years ago, they were producing, millions of chocolate bars. And the main, just to give you an example, their flagship brand, Cadbury's Dairy Milk, they were producing, it was producing 234 million bars a year. Now, in 2021, Mondelez announced a new investment, £15 million investment, to add a new production line and modernise some of the other facilities. And that will add an additional 122 million bars per year of capacity. So they will be producing close to 400 million bars of dairy milk alone. That's just one of the products per year. Carolyn, that's a great question. And the answer is you can't really smell the chocolate. You can see the huge silos where the materials are being stored. You sometimes can, but the problem is these days, you used to be able to, for most of the time that this factory's been here, you would have been able to. But these days, there are such strict hygiene requirements regarding food production and cross-contamination and so on, that it's really very sort of sanitized environment within the factory where the raw food materials are being processed. It's almost like a sort of a science lab. And so that means that, there's not just kind of got a window open in the production facility but from time to time you do. I mean, you do get it, but it's not a constant thing as it would once have been. So this little stream that flows through the site gives the area its name. This is the Bourne Brook. And this was a little stream, and it was called Bourne Brook Farm, was the land that the Cadbury brothers acquired. And this little stream flows through here. And originally the idea was that the village and the factory, that it was going to be called Bourne Brook. But they decided, that didn't sound very sophisticated. And at the time, there was a great love for all things continental, particularly all things French. And at that time, French confectionery and chocolate was seen as the very, very pinnacle. So they decided they wanted to give their factory and their village more of a French-seeming name. So they put the French word for town, ville, on the end. They took the Bourne from the Bourne Brook, and they called it Bournville, and that's where we get the name from. So the building in front of us here is part of the packaging plant at the factory, and they can wrap over 60,000 bars of chocolate per hour. And as somebody said, Bronwyn, you can't. The quantities of chocolate produced, millions and millions of chocolate bars and thousands being wrapped per hour. It is quite difficult to even imagine those quantities of chocolate. I can feel my blood sugar rising just talking about it. Nicole, I think that's right. Okay, Renee, that's interesting that they I'm sure they do adjust the recipes of their products to suit different markets and tastes. That would be, yeah, I'm not surprised. But no, really, you can see slightly the factory buildings are mainly still the 20th century buildings there, but it is a pretty huge operation. I think it's a really valid comment that when you work in food production, it doesn't always give you huge cravings. In fact, I've heard quite the opposite, that when people used to be here surrounded by the smell of chocolate every day, then people, it kind of almost does the opposite and puts them off a little bit. Yeah, Diane, I don't think they use palm oil from Indonesia anymore because they are quite. They have done quite a lot in terms of their um, environmental impact, like being involved with fair trade schemes for buying their raw materials and things like that. Ellen, did I buy a chocolate bar? I didn't, but then I'm diabetic, so I did go for a coffee in a very lovely coffee shop in the village that we'll see a little bit later. And yeah, I mean, Cadbury's one of the people do visit because they have a visitor attraction called Cadbury World, which is just around the corner here. It was actually closed on the day I filmed this, which has within it the world's largest Cadbury shop. And I'm going to put a few pictures of Cadbury World. We can see it sort of across the car park there, but we can't get too close because it was closed on the day we went. So I put in the chat a few photos of Cadbury World. You know, it might be a little bit better than the zoom that we've got here. There we go. Struggling with the zoom there. A little bit windy, you can see by the flags. And that has a big, and you don't have to pay to go into the visitor attraction to actually go to the chocolate shop. You can just kind of wander in and go in the huge Cadbury chocolate shop, where you can find pretty much anything to satisfy your sweet tooth. One of the things they do there are these bags that they call misshapes, and they're kind of things that are not quite exactly the right shape, or they've not come out quite right, and they just kind of put them in bags and seal them up and you buy them. So you're not quite sure ever what you're going to get, but as Forrest Gump might have said, but you know, it's a really, actually, they're really pretty good. You get a good bargain, and it's a good way to get some different Cadbury products. So Cadbury World is one of Birmingham's most popular visitor destinations. You know, it gets about 500,000 visitors a year. It opened in the early 90s. Quite popular with families. It's quite popular with school visits. They have kind of exhibitions about the history of the company and the history of chocolate making. You see a little bit of the factory, you see people doing hand decorating of chocolate products and things like that. So it's a pretty interesting visitor attraction, actually. I'm just trying to check. UK chocolate tastes different in Australia. An additive in warmer climates to inhibit melting a little. Okay. Well, I know that one of the things about chocolate is supposed to be that it melts at body temperature, I think, isn't it? So when you actually put it into your mouth and the temperature of the body, it comes up to that temperature, and that's the temperature when it starts to melt. I think that's I believe that is something to do with the manufacture. Now, here's for me one of the most interesting buildings in Bournville. This is St. Francis Church. Now, this is the parish church of this district these days, and it's a Church of England church. It's built in kind of a Mediterranean sort of Byzantine type style, and it was built in, well, they started building it before the First World War, but construction was then put on hold during the war, and it was eventually opened just into the 1920s. The reason I think this church is such an interesting building is because the Cadburys themselves were Quakers. That was their religion. They were Society of Friends, Quakers. And so, you know, you would think that they would be encouraging their own religious affiliation, but obviously they knew that not everyone who was working for Cadbury's, not everyone who was living in Bournville was Quaker, and a lot of people were Church of England, and they needed a parish church for baptisms, for weddings, and for all those kinds of things, and so they built this church, or had it built. And to me, that really shows that they are caring about the community, because if you're building religious buildings for a religious denomination that is not your own, I think that's quite a thing. That's quite a sign that you are doing this with some good intentions behind it, because a lot of it, it is a combination of social conscience and commercial interest. So this is Bournville Park, laid out as a green space and nature reserve for people, still a very popular place. Children's play area, very popular for dog walkers, for joggers. And here we have the main man who was responsible for most of this. There we are. That is a picture of Sir George Cadbury himself. In Bournville Park. Now, it's an interesting question on the colour scheme, because there has been some legal cases. Cadbury's have tried to get some kind of intellectual property protection on the specific colour, but they've not really ever been successful, because other companies wanted to use the same or very similar colour. So as things stand, I don't think they do have the rights exclusively to use that colour. I mean, although it is kind of in the UK at least very much associated with Cadbury's. So in a moment we're going to see the school building. These are the school buildings. So the school building here on the lower ground on the left was the original school that was built here for the Cadbury family. And then as the village expanded, they built the bigger school buildings that we can see further back. Still a school to this day. Just a local authority school these days, but a pretty good one. It's quite popular with parents in the area. And of course, that's another way that the Cadbury family are looking after their employees. They're providing places for their kids to get educated. It also means you've got the next generation of workers coming through and making sure they get a decent education as well. That's it. There is kind of a good commercial interest in that as well. And this very strange structure ahead of us is a musical instrument called a carillon. Now, a carillon is kind of a bell chime that is operated using a console, a bit like an organ, but and it rings the bells. It's quite a sophisticated thing. They used to be quite common, particularly on the European mainland at one time, but there are only a few of them in the UK that actually work. Jess, it's Carillon, a carillon. The largest of the bells is about 4 tons, and this does operate. Not many of them, even the ones that remain in the UK, operate. It does play, and if you search online, you'll find clips on YouTube of it playing at village festivals and things like that. And essentially, the story behind it is that George Cadbury and his wife went on holiday, and they went to Belgium, where these things were quite popular, and they saw a kind of a 17th century one in action, and George Cadbury said, "Oh, I'd love to have one of those in our village." And of course, George Cadbury wants something in his village, he gets it. Like, "Oh, a friend of yours plays a carillon." Now, I've had people before saying that I think there are a few of them there seem to be a few of them over in North America as well. I guess that they might have been quite popular at the time. Some of the earlier migrants were moving over there, people taking these traditions from their countries over there. And that's kind of perched on top of the school building as well. So, of course, I mentioned educating the next generation of workers. All of this is a social conscience, but it's also good commercial sense as well, because if you've got a happy and healthy workforce who are benefiting from having sick pay, company medical schemes, their kids are getting educated, they're getting a decent house, they're getting a pension scheme, a company pension scheme in the 19th century. Amazing things going on here. that makes a dedicated and highly motivated workforce. And of course, that rubs off in terms of productivity and loyalty. Now, this is one of the earliest public buildings built here. This is called Ruskin Hall, named after the 19th century artist and art critic, social commentator John Ruskin, who was someone who the Cadbury family greatly admired. And this was built as a kind of an adult education centre and community facility. So they offered courses in arts and crafts and music and different things like that for local people who were living here. And the hall was also used for concerts and things like that. These days, it is part of one of our universities here, the Birmingham City University, where it is part of the Birmingham Conservatoire, the music school. Deborah, it's the Ruskin Hall. And I wanted to come along the road here just to give you a little look at some of the houses. So these are quite typical Bournville houses. There are more modern houses that are much larger. Deborah, John Ruskin didn't do anything in there. They named it after him because the Cadbury family admired him. And the houses here are pretty spacious. You know, everyone had a garden front and back. Everybody had their own washing facilities and bathroom facilities within their houses. This is a total contrast to the kinds of areas these people would have been living in if they were living in central Birmingham. You know, they would have been crammed into very densely packed accommodation, sharing toilet facilities with numerous other families. So to be able to live in a place where you had your own space, privacy, place where you could have a little bit of space to grow some vegetables, maybe keep a pig or a few chickens, hugely different style of life and a much healthier style of life for the people. And the houses are pretty good. They're pretty spacious, and they are all different. They might look very similar, but they all have distinctive little things about them that make them unique. And it was part of George Cadbury's idea, because he once said that nobody should be condemned to live in a place where a rose will not grow. In other words, you know, in places like the polluted industrial city of Birmingham, people should live somewhere where they can grow plants and flowers and breathe some fresh air. Now, these days, as I mentioned earlier, the land here is owned by an organisation called the Bournville Village Trust, no longer by the Cadbury family, not for a long time, but the Bournville Village Trust does still maintain the village and the character of the village. They also retain a lot of the principles that it was founded on, in terms of what can be built here, what kind of businesses there can be. So, for example, the one thing you won't find in Bournville is a pub, because the Cadburys were Quakers. The Quakers were a teetotal religious group. You wouldn't find a pub here. But the village trust looks after the village these days and has quite a big role in what's going on, even though it's part of Birmingham. You know, it's run by the local council as well, public services. Now, this is the Quaker meeting hall, the Friends meeting hall. So this was the Cadbury family's own religious building, built by the same architect as the St. Francis Church, which was Harvey. And this is actually, for a Friends meeting hall, it's pretty elaborate, but again, designed in a historic style. Colleen, can employees own their home here? Well, to be honest, most people who work in the factory don't live here anymore. They can't afford to. The houses in the area are privately owned, but the land is owned still by the Cadbury Village Trust. So the houses are leasehold property. The houses themselves are privately owned, although the Village Trust does still own and manage several thousand homes. which they do provide at subsidised rents for retired former employees. They're also involved with a lot of social housing schemes for people with disabilities, special needs, and those kinds of things. So here's Sir George Cadbury again on the side of the Friends Meeting Hall. And underneath this statue are buried his ashes and those of his wife, Dame Elizabeth Cadbury. He is here surveying his village, if you like, looking out across the village green from the Friends Meeting home, which is great. And his wife, Elizabeth Cadbury, she outlived him, and she carried on his kind of social conscience, if you like. She was involved in a lot of schemes to do with promoting health and education, particularly for women. She was involved quite a lot in women's issues, promoting education and better career opportunities for women, better healthcare within Birmingham for many years. Now, this greenery in the middle of the village, this is the village green. This is the centre of Bournville village, designed to be like a traditional English village. At the centre, where in a traditional English village you might find a market hall or market cross, this is a little building called the Rest House. And these days it's a visitor centre for the Caroline and for Bournville village more generally. But it was, again, this was something that was donated by the employees on the occasion of Sir George and Dame Elizabeth Cadbury's 25th wedding anniversary. The employees had a collection, and then they built this beautiful rest house building, which has become one of kind of the symbols of Bournville, really. You know, this idea of having a village green environment with this little building at the centre has become quite an iconic thing. And you know, the idea from day one was always to look like their factory was in a traditional English village that had been there for hundreds of years. It's why they're using these Tudor style buildings, timber framed style, in the shops here. Now, this is kind of the main street of the original Bournville village shops, but you won't find here chain stores. So, you know, you find more traditional types of shops. There's a lovely butcher's there. There's a bakery, a greengrocer, a little general store. And there's also an excellent coffee shop on the end of the road where you can see the big kind of canopy outside next to the phone boxes. That was the original post office building of Bournville. Nowadays, it's an excellent coffee shop. You can tell it's excellent because it's always busy and it's difficult to get a seat. And across the way, the building, it's now a dental surgery, interesting thing to have near the chocolate factory, that was originally a bank. Now, the building that's under redevelopment here, until very recently, was also part of Birmingham City University. It was their international students department, but it was originally built by Cadbury's, as it was called the Day Continuation School. And the Cadbury family were very keen that their employees would get a good education. And that included once they'd started working, because a lot of people back in the day started work in the early 20th century. You know, they would start working at the factory at 14. But the Cadburys, from 1911, they built a school here and they made it compulsory for their employees who were teenagers to, on day release, so 1 or 2 days a week, they would come and go to school and learn, you know, maths, English, and they would also learn skills that would be relevant if they were doing apprenticeships in the factory. And they would get an education up until the ages of 18 or 21, depending on exactly what kind of jobs they were doing. Deborah, I don't know anybody else having issues with sound? I certainly hope not. So yeah, the building across the way there's sort of a little community shop there, and this was originally a bank. So they encouraged other businesses to kind of partner up with them. And this was originally Lloyd's Bank. So I mean, it's one of our biggest names in banking, Lloyd's Bank. But Lloyd's, like Cadbury's, was a Birmingham company. In fact, the original Lloyd's Bank was located about a stone's throw, literally, around the corner from the Cadbury's original 18th century shop in the centre of Birmingham. So the Cadburys and the Lloyds family had this big sort of long-standing knowledge of each other. They were two very successful Birmingham businesses that grew up close together. Now, when you have a traditional English village, what do you need? Well, you need a medieval manor house. Now, of course, there wasn't one here because it was farmland. But lucky for George Cadbury, a couple of miles away from here, there was a medieval manor house, a 14th century manor house that was in a pretty poor state and was due to be demolished. So George Cadbury bought it, had it dismantled, and then reconstructed by expert historic architects in his village, so that his village would have an authentic 14th century mansion house, a manor house. It's called Selly Manor, and this is it. It's legitimately authentic medieval building that's now kind of a visitor attraction. It's kind of a museum about late medieval and Tudor life. There are like costumes, and it's quite good for families. Beautiful garden as well, and behind it you can see the secondary building to the left of it, which is an old barn, and that is also a 15th century building, and that was brought here from a village called Minworth to the north of Birmingham. It's called Minworth Greaves, and that is a place that people can hire for events. It's also a place where people can get married. A colleague of mine, a fellow guide here in Birmingham, he got married there in Minworth Greaves. So a beautiful place to get married, right here next to the manor house. Bronwyn, any connection to Selly Oak? Yes, it's from. It was in Selly Oak or Selly Park, Selly Oak, Selly Park originally. That's where the manor house was. That's why it's called Selly Manor, because that's originally where it was. So a beautiful view back over. And this is another place where when I do this live, we struggle to get such a lovely view of Selly Manor because the signal is a bit sketchy in this particular part of Bournville. But in this format, we can finish with a lovely view of the manor house here. And what I hope what you've seen on this tour is that the Cadbury family have kind of done something pretty amazing here, particularly when we consider when they did it and what conditions were like for workers in many other places. To give you an example, things that we take for granted, like pension schemes, sick pay, working in good conditions. The fact that some employers like the Cadburys, like the Levers up in Liverpool at Port Sunlight, like other families like these, they were doing these kinds of schemes. That meant that people in other companies started to think, wait a minute, if they can have that, why can't we have that? And it really kind of gave a push to workers' rights movements and the trade unions and things like that, because it was really campaigning to get better rights across the board, not just for those people who happen to be working for companies like Cadbury's. And it's really important. And in fact, the school I was talking about, where they did the vocational training for their employees on day release, other people started to ask their employers in Birmingham, well, can you do something like this? And of course, they didn't want to build their own school. So they approached the Cadburys and they said, can we send our young employees to your school? And they said, well, you pay us a little bit. Yes, you can. And they had over 3,000 students there on day release from companies all over Birmingham who were using the Cadbury's educational facilities for their own workforce. It's an absolutely amazing story. Now, I did say that the old bank in Bournville here was a dental surgery, and actually it's quite a silly story that when I used to live not too far from Bournville, quite a long time ago, but the dentist that I used to go to was exactly on this street where we're standing here, where you got Selly Manor, Minworth Greaves, and the dental surgeries in one of the old Bournville houses. And I just it always made me smile. I just thought, what if there could ever be an ideal location for a dentist to be working, it is next to the chocolate factory. I just thought he must be the busiest dentist in the world. He's got these, they make the sugary snacks, and then he fixes your teeth afterwards. He was also an interesting dentist because he had a very unfortunate name for a dental surgeon. His name was Mr. Payne. And I always, Mr. Payne, the dentist, which I always use. Very nice chap, actually. Very, very good dentist. But that always made me smile when I lived in that area. So that does bring us to the end of our visit to Bournville this morning. And I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you've enjoyed having an opportunity to see it.